June the 11th, 2017 Manchester Victoria Station. Among the noise and movement, one brief confrontation on the platform would soon turn fatal. Charissa Brown-Wellington, once a mother trying to navigate years of instability and trauma, now stood at the center of a tragedy she could never take back. How could a moment of anger on a crowded platform end with a man falling beneath a moving tram? This was not a planned attack or a criminal feud, but a split-second loss of temper fueled by intoxication, impulsivity, and a long history of volatility. Inside Greater Manchester's most notorious, Yeomans STA, full list of female criminals and life sentences. Welcome to UK Real Crime, where the streets of Manchester whisper their harshest truths, and the hidden dangers of impulsive aggression are finally unmasked. Today, we look inside the case of Charissa Brown-Wellington, uncovering how a brief argument spiraled into an irreversible tragedy and how the justice system responded. What you're about to hear may stay with you long after this story ends. First offender, Charissa Brown-Wellington. June the 11th, 2017 Manchester Victoria Station. In the busy evening movement of the platforms, a brief exchange between two strangers spiraled with sudden, irreversible force, becoming the focal point of a case shaped by long-standing instability and impulsive violence. Charissa Brown-Wellington, then 31 years old, lived on Canal Street in Chadderton. She had an extensive criminal record, with 65 previous convictions that reflected a pattern of aggression and loss of control. Doctors had diagnosed her with a personality disorder associated with impulsive violence, and she carried a history of substance dependence and traumatic experiences. She was a mother of 2 or 3 children, navigating unstable circumstances, and she had herself been a victim of coercion and physical abuse in the years preceding her death in 2022. On the evening of the incident, she was intoxicated with alcohol and ecstasy when she confronted 30-year-old Philip Carter, a stranger. The argument began with a simple challenge, "What are you looking at?" and escalated quickly, each shouting at the other as a tram prepared to depart. Witnesses saw the exchange intensify, but within seconds it crossed a fatal threshold. As the tram moved, she stepped forward and pushed him forcefully with both hands to his chest. The impact caused him to fall backwards between 2 carriages. The injuries he sustained were catastrophic, and he died almost immediately. Brown-Wellington was detained soon afterwards. In her early accounts to police, she tried to explain her actions through personal history and the events of that moment, but investigators relied primarily on CCTV footage that captured the confrontation and the push. Evidence presented in court drew a clear distinction between an argument and the act that ended a man's life. She had initially been charged with murder, but later pleaded guilty to manslaughter. At Manchester Crown Court on the 31st of October 2017, she received a 5-year sentence, along with an extended license period of 3 years, because she was deemed a dangerous offender. Her extensive criminal history and the devastating outcome shaped the court's assessment. Although she wept and insisted the death had been an accident, the judge concluded that her actions showed deliberate aggression and a complete loss of temper. For Philip Carter's family, the sentence offered limited comfort. They spoke of missing him every minute of every day and described the difficulty of rebuilding their lives after the sudden, violent loss of a son and brother. They acknowledged that no length of imprisonment could undo the harm or ease their grief. Brown-Wellington's own trajectory ended abruptly years later. Having been released on license, she struggled with continued instability, substance misuse, and emotional distress. On the 2nd of February 2022, she died from a fatal combination of heroin, methadone, and cocaine. At the time, probation officers had been seeking her recall to custody, so don't let a few minutes of anger make you regret it for the rest of your life. Second offender, Coleen Campbell. July the 2nd, 2022 Mossley, Tameside. In the waning light of a summer evening, a series of decisions taken over weeks would converge on one doorstep, setting in motion a conspiracy that had been quietly forming beyond public view. Coleen Campbell, born on the 27th of March 2084, was a mother of 2 and the former wife of 38-year-old Thomas Campbell. They had been married for a decade and shared a long, complicated history, but by mid-2022, their relationship had fractured. Living on Bamford Street in Clayton, she was no longer part of his day-to-day life. Her role became entangled with 3 men, Rhys Stephen, aged 29, Stephen Cleworth, aged 38, and the alleged orchestrator, 28-year-old John Belfield. What had begun as a plan called a meticulously thought-out conspiracy to rob Thomas Campbell of valuables, particularly 2 Rolex watches, Only days earlier, on the 29th of June 2022, Campbell had taken part in a separate street attack in Ashton-under-Lyne. She struck a woman, Niamh Wasik, with a hammer during a confrontation involving 3 others, stole the victim's handbag before leaving the scene. On the night of the 2nd of July, Thomas Campbell returned to his home in Mossley, unaware that he was being watched. As he opened his front door, he was ambushed by the group who had prepared for this moment. He was dragged inside, and just in 2 hours, he was brutally attacked, with 61 wounds in total. Thomas Campbell died from the assault, and his body was discovered the following day. Campbell was arrested in the days following the murder. According to her family, she had spent that period accepting comfort from relatives and presenting distress, despite knowing the role she had played in the events leading to her former husband's death. She said that she believed the plan was only to rob him, but messages, call data, and CCTV placed her inside the planning phase. Detectives from Greater Manchester Police located the tracker placed on the victim's van and recovered surveillance footage showing her meeting with Stephen and Cleworth. Phone records demonstrated she had been providing the group with precise updates on his whereabouts. At Bolton Crown Court in February 2023, a jury found her guilty of manslaughter and conspiracy to rob. Stephen was convicted of murder and conspiracy to rob, receiving a minimum term of 37 years. Cleworth was convicted of manslaughter and conspiracy to rob, receiving a minimum term of 12 years. Belfield, who had initially fled, was later convicted of murder and conspiracy to rob in 2025. Campbell received a 13-year sentence, with an 18-month term for the earlier street attack ordered to run concurrently. She is currently held at HMP Drake Hall in Staffordshire. The impact on the victim's family was severe. Thomas Campbell's father described the grief as something that spread through generations, affecting not only himself, but also the grandchildren left behind. His brother spoke of the shock of having comforted Coleen in the days after the killing, unaware of her involvement. They told the court they would never forgive her, and described the ordeal as unimaginably painful. Even in moments shaped by resentment or jealousy, the choices made can alter the course of multiple lives forever. Third offender, Amy Squires and Megan Stafford. October the 30th, 2016, Kings Road, Ashton-under-Lyne. In the stillness of the early hours, an unfamiliar disturbance marked the beginning of one of Greater Manchester's most disturbing intrusion assaults. Amy Squires, aged 27, of Coronation Road, and Megan Stafford, aged 28, of Dean Street, were strangers to the 78-year-old man whose path they crossed that night. Both had entered his property without permission. Their presence was not connected to any prior relationship or dispute. It was an encounter born purely of intrusion, but what followed went far beyond the boundaries of burglary. When the victim confronted them shortly after 4 o'clock in the morning, the situation changed immediately. He was pushed to the floor and repeatedly kicked in the face and body. As he lay defenseless, Squires retrieved a knife from the kitchen and stabbed him in the neck. Stafford continued searching the property, taking his watch and cash, before joining in further acts intended to silence him. Together, they placed a bag over his head in an attempt to suffocate him, ignoring his requests for help. When he pleaded for an ambulance, the telephone was torn from the socket. The assault continued for approximately 4 hours, during which the two drank the alcohol they had taken from his home. The ordeal ended only when he was struck over the head with a statue, leaving him unconscious in a pool of blood. He later awoke to find both women asleep on the sofa. Using a crutch and walking stick, he managed to leave the house and reach the street, where a passerby called emergency services. Responding officers entered the property and found Squires and Stafford still asleep, unaware that the victim had escaped, and alerted help. They were arrested immediately. Detective Chief Inspector Richard Ennis of Greater Manchester Police led the investigation. The victim's statement, delivered despite severe injuries, formed the foundation of the case. Forensic work supported his account, documenting all their brutal acts. Digital and physical evidence established that the two women had acted with clear intent to kill, a conclusion reinforced by the prolonged duration of the attack and their behavior throughout the night. Both defendants later admitted attempted murder. At Minshull Street Crown Court in June 2017, Squires and Stafford received sentences of 13 years and 6 months each. The judge noted the vulnerability of the victim, the brutality of the assault, and the sustained intent to end his life. Local residents struggled to comprehend that such violence had unfolded inside a quiet residential street. This case underscores 3 essential cautions. Vulnerability can turn ordinary homes into isolated crime scenes. Intoxication does not diminish responsibility, but often increases danger, and early reporting of suspicious activity may prevent harm before it occurs. Even behind closed doors, the decisions made in a single moment can determine whether another person survives the night. Fourth offender, Claire McMahon. May the 22nd, 2019, Pennine Terrace, Dukinfield. As the night settled over the row of flats, sounds from an upper floor disrupted the stillness, signaling the beginning of an eruption that had taken shape out of a private argument behind closed doors. Claire McMahon, born on the 7th of September 1984, lived in the small Dukinfield flat she shared with her partner, 37-year-old John Robinson. He was also her victim. She was 34 at the time, and she had a turbulent relationship that neighbors occasionally noticed through raised voices and sudden commotions. She had no accomplices, no wider conspiracy around her, and no documented history of mental illness or addiction. Shortly before midnight on Wednesday, the 22nd of May 2019, an argument inside the flat escalated rapidly. Inside the bedroom, the confrontation turned violent when McMahon armed herself with a knife and stabbed John Robinson for the first time. Rather than withdraw or seek help, she left the room, walked into the kitchen, and picked up a second knife, further escalating the situation. The struggle moved toward the balcony as Robinson tried to get away from her. Neighbors who heard the commotion stepped outside and saw the two of them grappling in a brief but frantic tussle. In that moment, McMahon continued the assault, delivering additional stab wounds while they struggled at the balcony rail. Robinson soon collapsed, falling to the ground and gasping for air as the injuries overwhelmed him. Someone called emergency services, and paramedics arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. He was dead at the scene. McMahon was arrested the following day on suspicion of murder. The investigation that unfolded, led by Senior Investigating Officer Duncan Thorpe, was described as methodical and thorough. Detectives traced the sequence of the confrontation, examined the physical evidence, and assembled statements from those who had witnessed portions of the struggle. The details established during the inquiry provided prosecutors with a clear framework for presenting the case to the jury. Her explanation of events, which did not dispute being involved in the argument, could not account for the extent or manner of the fatal injuries. At Manchester Crown Court on the 3rd of December 2019, the jury returned a verdict of murder. The retrieval and use of the second knife and the sustained escalation of the violence shaped the court's view of her intent during the incident. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge setting a minimum term of 18 years before she would be eligible for parole. John Robinson's family later described him as having a heart of gold, a sentiment that underscored the depth of their loss. They spoke of devastation, of a sudden gap in their lives created in a matter of minutes during an argument that spiraled beyond any point of control. McMahon remains in custody, serving her life sentence. Her future, defined by the court's minimum term, now unfolds far from the flat, where the events of that night irreversibly altered the course of two intertwined lives. Fifth offender, Kelly Gray. May the 17th, 2019, Berwick Street, Rochdale. On a spring evening in a residential neighborhood, a dispute that had begun hours earlier over damage to a tradesman's van moved rapidly toward confrontation that would end in a single and shocking moment. Kelly Gray, born in 1984 and was an Irish, was 31 years old at the time, a mother of four living an unsettled life, had no fixed address. On that evening, she became part of a chaotic street fight involving her relatives and the family of 23-year-old David Gavin, a father of two and an experienced boxer. Shortly before 9 o'clock that night, May the 17th, 2019, the confrontation erupted outside the Gavin home when the family returned to challenge the Grays about the alleged damage to the van. What followed was a brawl involving fists and makeshift weapons. As the scene grew louder and more frantic, Gray arrived accompanied by her two children and her mother. Seeing the disorder ahead of her, she ran toward the clash, holding a large kitchen knife. In the confusion, the knife was driven once into David Gavin's neck. He collapsed soon after and was taken to the Royal Oldham Hospital, where he was dead at 10:25 that same night. Meanwhile, Gray fled from the street within minutes. Witnesses described her saying she needed to get my baby, and by the early hours of the 19th of May, she and other family members had traveled to Ireland, likely by ferry from Holyhead. The investigation that followed, led by Greater Manchester Police, focused not only on the events of the fight, but on locating Gray after her departure. A European arrest warrant was issued, and on the 26th of August, 2019, she was found in Ireland and returned to the United Kingdom. Medical assessments conducted after her arrest presented a picture of a woman profoundly affected by trauma. 5 experts concluded she was experiencing severe PTSD at the time of the incident, a condition that could cause her to believe she and her family were under imminent threat. Her plea to manslaughter on the grounds of loss of self-control was accepted by prosecutors in light of this evidence, though the court retained a clear view that she had joined the disturbance rather than attempted to stop it. In October 2020 at Manchester Crown Court, she was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Judge Patrick Field QC described it as a particularly serious case of manslaughter, shaped by both the level of violence and the tragic consequences. Gray showed emotional distress throughout the hearing, but the court ruled that whatever fear she may have experienced, her actions remained gravely disproportionate. For the Gavin family, the outcome brought complex relief. His mother spoke of devastation, noting that his young daughter suffered nightmares, and asked when her father would return. His brother maintained that the act was murder, even though the legal verdict differed. The loss felt especially acute. David Gavin died only weeks before the birth of his second child. Gray is now serving her sentence, confined far from the street where the violence unfolded, and from the family whose lives were permanently reshaped in the span of a single, chaotic confrontation. Her case underscores the fragile boundary between fear and misjudgment, and how a moment of distorted perception can alter the future for everyone standing within its reach. Sixth offender, Dawn Barr. November 20th, 2012, John Avenue, Cheadle, Stockport. In the late hours of a cold November night, the familiar tension inside a family home began to rise once again, drawing two former partners back into a cycle of argument that had persisted long after their separation. Dawn Barr, 41 years old, lived at the address with her 4 children. Her relationship with 32-year-old Darren Orett, the children's father, had come to an end after he discovered her involvement with another man. Their separation did little to steady the atmosphere between them, and their messages showed their broken bond. On the 20th of November, they spent part of the day Christmas shopping in Stockport before going their separate ways. Before midnight, Orett returned to the house after hearing his daughter missed him and that Barr had been drinking while responsible for the children. Shortly after 11:30 that night, an argument began in the kitchen. Voices rose quickly as the confrontation escalated. When Orett hid her phone's devices she had used to speak to her new partner earlier that evening, the dispute intensified. By midnight on the 21st of November, Barr had armed herself with a knife she had acquired that day, and, in a loss-of-control state, she delivered a single blow to Orett's neck. The children were inside the house as he collapsed onto the floor. Moments later, Barr phoned emergency services, pleading for Orett to wake while he lay bleeding. He was taken to hospital but died soon after. Barr was arrested later that day and charged with murder. The investigation that followed focused on her conflicting statements and the messages she had exchanged 2 days earlier with her new partner, where threats had been made in anger. She first claimed he stabbed himself, then acknowledged she had been holding the knife, but said she could not recall the moment the wound was inflicted. Senior Investigating Officer Duncan Thorpe described the inquiry as thorough, drawing together evidence of the argument, the knife, and Barr's admissions. These elements guided prosecutors in presenting the case that ultimately led the jury to clear her of murder, but convict her of manslaughter through loss of control. On the 23rd of May, 2013 at Manchester Crown Court, Judge Michael Henschel sentenced Barr to 9 years in prison. He recognized that she had grown exasperated by Orett's repeated visits, but emphasized that her new relationship had clouded her judgment and contributed directly to the emotional volatility that preceded the fatal act. For Orett's family, the verdict brought little comfort. They remembered him as a devoted father, deeply involved in the lives of his children. Relatives had warned him not to go to the house that night, a regret that now weighs heavily. In court, the depth of their grief became clear. Someone shouted, "Suffer," as Barr was led away. Beyond the conviction, the family now carry the reality that 4 children will grow up knowing their mother killed their father. Barr continues to serve her sentence, bound by the consequences of a moment in which anger, exhaustion, and fractured loyalties collided inside a small suburban kitchen, altering the shape of 2 families' lives for years to come. 7th offender, Stacey Smith. November 11th, 2023 Tameside, Greater Manchester. Before dawn had fully broken, a quiet residential street became the setting for a confrontation that had its origins not in domestic unrest, but in months of workplace tension unfolding far from the home where the violence would erupt. Stacey Smith, aged 46, lived in Newton Heath, Manchester, and had worked in the ambulance service since 2017. Her relationship with her manager, Mishala Morton, had once been cooperative, but had deteriorated as work patterns changed and expectations shifted. At 5:30 on the morning of the 11th of November, Smith was already waiting outside Morton's house. When Morton stepped outside to begin her shift, Smith approached her with a hammer she had brought for the purpose. Morton was struck repeatedly on the head as Smith shouted threats of fatal intent. Neighbors, alerted by the noise, ran to help and ensured the weapon left behind would be preserved for police. Morton sustained life-changing head injuries and a broken wrist from raising her arm to shield herself. Smith left the area shortly after the assault. In a text message sent to a friend, she admitted what she had done in blunt, casual language that would later become a central piece of evidence. Though she indicated a desire to flee to Liverpool, she ultimately walked into Ashton Police Station, where she was arrested on suspicion of attempted murder. The investigation, led by officers from the Tameside Criminal Investigation Department of Greater Manchester Police, moved quickly. The hammer was recovered, and digital evidence showed that Smith had found Morton's address online and examined her work schedule. Her previously phone message acknowledging the attack was decisive in establishing intent. These strands, brought together in a methodical inquiry, shaped the case that prosecutors presented to the court. In October 2024, at Manchester Crown Court, Smith was found guilty of attempted murder. She had previously admitted causing grievous bodily harm with intent, but denied intending to kill. The jury, however, concluded otherwise. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with an additional 5-year license period beyond release. The judge remarked on the planning, the intensity of the violence, and the absence of meaningful remorse. Morton survived the attack, though the effects remain profound. A detective involved in the case later stated that while physical wounds may heal in time, the psychological trauma would stay with her for life. Smith now serves her sentence, far removed from the workplace where frustrations first took root. In the quiet of early morning, the choices made that day continue to reverberate, shaping the lives of two women whose professional paths had once run side by side and now stand at opposite ends of a single violent act. 8th offender, Jemma Marshall. September 10, 2023, Ashton Road, Oldham. As evening settled along the main road, a brief encounter between a passing car and a vulnerable man walking toward a local shop became the opening moment of an unexpected chain of events. Jemma Marshall, aged 37, lived on Trent Road in Shaw with her 3 children. To those who knew her casually, she appeared to be a mother involved in community work, having spent years volunteering for charities and caring for vulnerable adults. Beneath that outward impression, however, she had become trapped in addiction after unknowingly smoking crack cocaine, and over time, she slipped into the role of a loan shark, lending money to people whose own dependencies left them exposed to exploitation. One such person was 45-year-old Martin Shaw, who struggled with drug and alcohol issues and who owed her money. Late on the 10th of September, Marshall drove her Audi along Ashton Road with her associate, 37-year-old Jason Wadsworth. Moments after passing Shaw, Marshall turned onto a side street and stopped the vehicle. Wadsworth stepped out, spoke briefly to Shaw, and forced him into the back seat. What occurred next happened inside the car, a sustained beating that left Shaw with multiple rib fractures and an injury to his spleen. During the assault, Marshall's concern focused on the blood being sprayed inside her vehicle. Afterward, she drove Shaw toward his home, initially taking a wrong route that prolonged the journey, and the pair escorted him inside at approximately 9:50 that evening. The household was already unsettled. His roommate fled after being assaulted by Wadsworth and contacted police. When officers arrived, Shaw minimized what had happened, giving only a brief account despite visible injuries. Later that night, after officers had left, Shaw's condition deteriorated rapidly. He collapsed and was taken to the Royal Oldham Hospital. He remained there for nearly 8 weeks, undergoing treatment for significant internal trauma. Marshall was arrested on the 12th of September. During questioning, she denied wrongdoing, claiming she had only driven Shaw home and heard a struggle in the back seat. Detectives, however, reviewed CCTV footage showing Marshall and Wadsworth at the property shortly before Shaw's collapse and obtained testimony from his roommate. Medical experts later established a direct link between the beating on the 10th of September and Shaw's death on the 4th of November, concluding that the fatal liver failure had been triggered by internal bleeding caused by the injuries to his ribs and spleen. In November 2025, a jury at Manchester Crown Court cleared Marshall of murder but convicted her of manslaughter. Wadsworth was also convicted as part of the joint enterprise. Their sentencing was scheduled for the 22nd of December that year. Prosecutors noted that Marshall had preyed on vulnerable individuals and used intimidation and violence to enforce debts, describing the assault on Shaw as terrifying and brutal. For Shaw's loved ones, the outcome brought some measure of resolution. A senior Crown prosecutor expressed hope that the verdict would provide some sense of justice, though the length of time between the assault and Shaw's death had left the family with a long, painful uncertainty. Marshall now awaits sentencing, held in custody as the legal process draws toward its close. The choices made on that September night, shaped by addiction, exploitation, and violence, continue to echo through the lives of all who were drawn into her orbit, culminating in a fatal encounter from which only consequences remain. Ninth offender, Leanne Bentley. May the 20th, 2020, Greater Manchester. On a quiet spring evening, a brief confrontation outside a modest home in Wythenshawe turned abruptly into an act of violence no one on the street anticipated. Leanne Bentley, born on the 23rd of October 1992, lived on Brookcroft Road. At 27, she had no documented history of serious offending, and nothing in her circumstances suggested she might one day make a shocking decision. On the evening of Wednesday, the 20th of May 2020, at a house on Brookcroft Road in Wythenshawe, Bentley had come to the address as part of a small gathering of friends. Peter Richardson, known in the neighborhood but not closely linked to her, entered the property uninvited. His refusal to leave unsettled those inside, and a brief scuffle moved out toward the front garden. A neighbor intervened, and Richardson apologized before turning away to walk from the property. Moments later, as he stepped onto the pavement, Bentley emerged from the house with a knife, ran toward him, and delivered a single blow to his back. Richardson managed only a short distance before collapsing. Emergency services arrived quickly, and he was taken to hospital, where he died in the early hours of the 21st of May. Bentley was arrested in the days that followed. The investigation was led by officers from Greater Manchester Police's Major Investigation Team, who began by establishing a clear timeline of events at the Brookcroft Road address. Initial statements from neighbors and occupants outlined the disturbance inside the property, but detectives moved quickly to secure independent corroboration. Forensic teams examined the scene, mapping the physical evidence along the street and recovering the knife, later confirmed as the weapon. Laboratory analysis established that the blade bore no defensive imprint from Richardson, supporting the conclusion that he had not faced Bentley or attempted to engage with her. Officers compared witness accounts with medical assessments, noting that the characteristics of the injury aligned with a single, forceful strike from behind. On the 10th of December 2020, she appeared at Manchester Crown Square Court for sentencing. The judge noted that the confrontation inside the house had been brief, but the stabbing represented a sudden and disproportionate escalation. Bentley received a sentence of 6 years and 9 months in prison. A senior detective expressed condolences to Richardson's family, acknowledging the enduring difficulty of understanding a death arising from a moment that should have been over as soon as the victim turned away. Bentley now serves her sentence within the prison system. The events of that night, beginning with an uninvited entry, show how a single impulsive choice can alter the course of multiple lives in an instant. Final offender, Yeomans. April the 23rd, 2023, Hyde, Tameside. In the early hours of a spring afternoon, a private domestic dispute turned irrevocably violent within moments. Katie Yeomans, born on the 31st of July 1995, lived at a house on Thoresby Avenue with her partner, 28-year-old Rhys Howarth. Outwardly, she was a 27-year-old woman with no known history of serious offending, but tensions inside the relationship had been mounting. On Sunday, the 23rd of April 2023, Yeomans and Mr. Howarth had been drinking since the previous night, and the atmosphere inside the house gradually soured. A domestic argument escalated, voices rising as the afternoon wore on. Shortly after 2:25, the dispute reached its peak. In a loss-of-control moment, Yeomans took hold of a knife and struck Mr. Howarth, once in the upper chest. She attempted a brief call to emergency services before contacting a family member, who arrived to find Mr. Howarth collapsed in the hallway. A second 999 call was made, but despite rapid attendance by paramedics, he was dead soon after. Yeomans was arrested the same day on suspicion of murder. The investigation that followed, led by detectives from Greater Manchester Police, focused on reconstructing the couple's movements, the nature of the disturbance, and the events immediately preceding the stabbing. Officers examined mobile phone activity, gathered forensic evidence confirming the fatal injury, and cross-checked witness statements from those who had arrived shortly after the incident. While the broader context of the argument remained clouded by intoxication and conflicting recollections, investigators were able to establish that the wound resulted from a single deliberate blow inflicted during a moment of heightened emotional volatility. In the end, Yeomans entered a guilty plea to manslaughter on the grounds of loss of control, which the Crown accepted. On the 8th of November 2023, Yeomans appeared before Manchester Crown Court for sentencing. She was 28 years old. The judge acknowledged the highly charged domestic context and the disinhibiting effect of prolonged drinking, but emphasized that the decision to pick up a knife represented a catastrophic loss of judgment. She was sentenced to 5 years and 3 months imprisonment. For Mr. Howarth's family, the outcome brought only partial solace. They described him as a larger-than-life character, funny, loving, active, and deeply missed. Their statements conveyed the enduring ache of losing someone whose presence had animated their daily lives, extinguished by a single moment that could not be taken back. Yeomans now serves her term within the prison estate. From this case, there are some warnings that reminded us: domestic disputes can escalate within seconds when alcohol lowers inhibition and magnifies emotional volatility. The presence of a weapon transforms a passing argument into a life-altering act from which no one involved can step back. Seeking help or stepping away at the first sign of loss of control may be the only barrier between conflict and irreversible harm. Even in ordinary households, a single misjudged action can determine a future none of those present ever intended. As this case closes, we're left with a reminder that the quietest homes can hide the most volatile moments, and that a single decision made in a rush of anger or fear can ripple far beyond the walls where it happened. Stories like this shape the darker edges of everyday life across the UK, revealing how thin the line can be between conflict and catastrophe. If you want to follow more real investigations, more untold timelines, and more cases that continue to haunt communities long after the headlines fade, make sure you subscribe to UK Real Crime and tap the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. And if there's a case you believe deserves attention, drop your suggestions in the comments below. Your idea may be the next story we unravel.